Today we're going to be talking about the process of composing a score for a big budget documentary. That's up next. This is a little bit of the score from Prehistoric Planet, composed by my guest today, who I'll introduce in a moment. And hello, welcome to the Musician Toolkit, episode number 22. I am your host, David Lane. It is great to be with you once again. We've already had a couple of episodes where we've talked about film scoring already. Specifically, we talked to Dr. Frank Lehman a couple of times about the music of John Williams. But today is going to be the first time that we talk about the scoring process, in this case for a documentary series, while talking to the composers themselves. My guests today are Anže Rozman and Talve, and they are the featured composers for the series Prehistoric Planet. They both work through a company called Bleeding Fingers, which is a film music company that was co-founded by the legendary composer Hans Zimmer and Russell Emanuel. That company has scored the music for quite a few documentary features. Another notable one lately that we're not discussing today is Frozen Planet 2. But today we're talking to Anže and Kara about their collaborative process for scoring Prehistoric Planet, which is a series that has season 1 already out on Apple TV Plus and will soon have season 2 coming, in which they scored that as well. Among the number of things we're going to talk about is what it's like to collaborate as a composers. You might be listening to this and you are a composer and maybe you've only composed by yourself. So it's a different experience when you are working together and trying to come up with some music that sounds like it was written by one person. So we talk quite a bit about that. We talk about spotting the film, and you'll learn what spotting is if you don't know already. We learn about creating what's called the mock-up, and then having it orchestrated, and all the way to the scoring session, which took place in Wales, with an orchestra exceeding 80 members. Now, if you've been listening to the Musician Toolkit for a while, you know I'm all about the tools that make up musicianship. Of course, we're going to be talking about composition, but we're also going to be talking about collaboration, and we're also going to be talking about studio technology and also performing instruments, because a lot of the instruments in this score were custom built, and therefore the composers were the first to ever have to actually perform the instruments, so they had to learn as they went. So without any further delay, here's my conversation with Anže and Kara. Well, it's my pleasure today to be talking to Anže Rozman and Kara Talve, and these are composers who've worked on the series of Prehistoric Planet. So, guys, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So, let's just we'll just start with you, Kara. Just tell us a little bit. How did you get into, what was the moment you decided that you wanted to be a composer? And was it always a composer for, multimedia like films and television, or did you find your way to that after doing other things?
Yeah, well, I came from a family of musicians. My dad's a musician. My grandma was an excellent classical pianist. And that's sort of why I started taking piano lessons. And for a while as a kid, I wasn't that interested in it. I was very good at playing piano, but I was annoyed simultaneously that I had to go to piano lessons. And it wasn't always clear if I would pursue music or go do something else. But probably by the end of high school, I realized it actually is my calling and the thing that I'm meant to be doing. So then from there, I went to Berklee College of Music, and I was really inspired by The Shawshank Redemption, Thomas Newman's score. Yes. And that's the thing that really inspired me to get into film composing specifically. And then after I graduated, I moved out to LA and had various internships and assistant positions until I eventually was hired as a composer at Bleeding Fingers.
Well, great. Now, you said, Shawshank Redemption inspired you to become a film composer. Was that after you were already at Berkeley? Were you doing something else there?
No, when I entered Berkeley, I was already
Great.
really excited about that film scoring program that I heard so much about.
Excellent.
And they have a really great program that gives you a very nice foundation to actually do this professionally.
Great. And Anže, how did you come into this career?
I'll give you a short biography.
Sure.
So I was born and raised in Slovenia. It's a small chicken-shaped country bordering Italy, Austria, Croatia, and Hungary. And my grandparents were music lovers, so I would go to concerts with them from a very early age, like 4 or 5 years old. And after these concerts of usually the Slovenian Philharmonics or the Opera House Orchestra, I would still have music resonating in my head. But it took a few years until I realized that the music that was resonating in my head was of my own, not something that I've heard. So that kind of sparked the urge in me in trying to figure out how to write it down. So fast forward till when I was, I guess, around 12, 13, when Gladiator came out. I was completely, impressed by Hans Zimmer's score. And that kind of sparked the interest in me in pursuing film scoring as well. So I attended the Music Conservatory in Slovenia, and then later the Academy of Music in Slovenia, studied composition. And then I did my master's at Berklee College of Music in Valencia, film scoring program. And then fast forward to the end of the program, they took us to London to Air Studios to record our final project with a 54-piece orchestra.
Wow.
And lucky for me and everyone else there, I guess, Christopher Nolan and Hans Zimmer were recording Interstellar there at the same time. So they were locked out of the studio for 2 days because of us Berklee students taking over. So I briefly met Hans there, and then another coincidence happened a few months later where he stumbled upon my recording online on the VI Control Forum. So my recording from Air Studios. And he basically replied to the post saying, "This is brilliant. Now I'm not so mad that you kids stole my studio." And then we kind of kept in touch throughout the years. I mean, briefly over Facebook. And then in 2017, I basically called Hans and asked if I can come work here.
Wow.
And a few months later, I was here. So that's my short story.
Well, what's that like, hearing Gladiator and having that be the inspiration for you to become a film composer, and then to find yourself working with the very composer?
I mean, I'm not religious or spiritual in any way, but a few things in my life, especially in my career path, have gone down interesting, so many coincidences had to happen in order for me to be where I am right now. And I feel extremely lucky and privileged to be, I guess, one of the few that actually had a goal and managed to, come to it. In a sense, as a kid listening to Gladiator and Hans Zimmer being one of the most renowned film composers of our era, or maybe also of all time, and then being able to walk beside him in a sense is quite mind-blowing. And I have to pinch myself every so often.
Right. Well, that's a wonderful story. Let's we won't spend a whole lot of time on your career leading to this point. We're going to talk about Prehistoric Planet. So now I know the theme is composed by Hans Zimmer and Andrew James Christie, and my understanding is that the two of you worked on the series music, all of the underscores, for each episode. So maybe dissect that a little bit further, because one thing I do have, I did go to a school that had film music, and so I know a little bit about the process from like very long ago, and I've done some independent work, but I've always worked solo. I've never collaborated, and I'm just kind of curious about that whole aspect. So, how do you guys basically separate the work, or do you separate the work? Do you work on the same things at the same time? What is collaborating as composers on a series like for you?
Well, before every episode starts, we have a spotting session. That's kind of the first thing that happens. And that session is very important for the rest of our artistic experience on that episode, because the directors and the showrunners are going to give us insights as to what they want for each scene, emotions that they want to convey, things that they want to hit, things that they don't want to hit, things that we should know there's going to be sound design here. Don't cover it up with music, things like that might not be so clear in the rough picture. So we get all this information, and after we've done that, we kind of sit down as a team and decide who's going to be assigned which cue. And that can come from, a place of, I think Anže would be really great at this one, and he thinks I would be great at a different scene, and we kind of split it up like that.
Right.
I do agree with everything that Kara said, but mind you that the way me and Kara work together is very interlocked, in a sense where even if she starts a cue, we would always listen back and forth to what we were writing.
Right.
In order to have the score be very homogeneous. Like a good example is in the Coasts episode, and on the soundtrack, the track is called Alcyone and Phosphodraco.
Mm-hmm.
It's this very, very long scene of baby pterosaurs flying off a cliff over the ocean to reach the promised forest land where they're safe, and they get attacked by larger pterosaurs on their way. But that whole 9.5-minute piece of music, I think, was split into 4 parts between us. So Kara did the first part, I did the second part, then Kara did the cliff diving scene, and I did the ending, chase scene. But it all blends into one that no one would really know that it was composed by 2 people and then kind of glued together.
Right.
And the other thing I wanted to say is, sometimes I would struggle with a cue, and Kara, can you come listen to this? And Kara would switch around a few notes, and I was like, this is exactly what I want. This is exactly what I've needed,
Right.
For the past 2 hours. Or Kara's like, I need something different on this cue, and we would record one of our custom instruments in my studio. So it was, a very collaborative process in that sense. It's not just us locked in each in our own studios and working on our own stuff, and then seeing what happens at the end.
Right. And that explains quite a bit about just the technical aspect of getting the work done as a team. But I'm most curious because I'm certain that when you two write your own music, it doesn't sound like each other, and yet you have to agree on harmonic choices, melodic material. And by the way, that's something I do want to note about Prehistoric Planet. If there's a criticism, fair or unfair, about a lot of modern scores, is that a lot of times melody is underemphasized or sometimes omitted for a lot of scores. But that's not the case with Prehistoric Planet. You guys have some very rich melodies, some great melodic material. And so how do you decide? I guess, for example, Kara, would you come up with a melody and you make use of that, and then Anže, you do likewise, or do you choose like the harmonic language of the film? And that's what I'm really curious about. How do you guys make decisions about that?
I'm just gonna jump in. I know the question was for Kara, but I think all the good melodies in the season are either Kara's or the main theme.
Oh,
That's not true. The first sunrise is your melody, and that one's good.
That's maybe.
Yeah. I think that luckily that's probably why we're grouped together to do certain projects.
yeah.
Because we already have a similar harmonic sound. Like I feel like you'd have to be really invested in both of us to hear the really subtle differences between our harmonic vocabulary.
Right.
It's
Right.
very similar, and we use similar sample libraries, and we have a similar way of orchestrating things. So at the end of the day, even if our melodies are slightly different, the sound is homogeneous because of those factors.
Right.
And there's two more factors to it that we started working at Bleeding Fingers at roughly the same time. So we kind of learned from each other from the get-go. And the other aspect that we usually don't disclose in these podcasts, but since we're talking about this, we also live together and are engaged.
Oh.
So that probably helps as well that, work for us never really stops. Even when we are at home and we're eating dinner, we sometimes talk about the next scene or what are we going to do here. So that's why I think our collaboration is so tight and so unique in a sense.
Right. And I guess the last thing related to that, so you mentioned, Bleeding Fingers is where you work, and that's one of Hans Zimmer's companies. So how much of musical decisions come from Hans Zimmer himself?
If we're talking about collaboration, the whole premise, if that's the right word I'm using, Bleeding Fingers is that collaborative aspect from the down up. If we start from just how people start working here, they usually start working here as assistants. For example, Kara has 3 people on her team. I have 2 people on my team, and the assistants can get promoted to junior composers. So I have a junior composer and assistant. Kara has 2 junior composers and an assistant. And then junior composers can go up to composers. And even when you're a composer, you still have people higher up than you. And for us, that's our CEO, Russell Emanuel, who's also the score producer for Prehistoric Planet, and of course, Hans. So what makes Bleeding Fingers super unique is that, let's say me and Kara are working on Prehistoric episode, and we spend 2-3 days on a queue each. We listen back to each other's music. We give each other, like, quote unquote revisions. Then even if we mark it version 1, it might be version 3 for us when we send it to Russell and Hans. And Hans and Russell would give us revisions. And we would mark it down to version 1 again before we send it to the clients, even though it might have been version 5 or version 6.
Right.
So when we send it to the clients, any music, it's super flushed out already. The ideas are clear. There's no, if I can say, half-assing it,
Yeah.
Because first, we're never going to send something to Russell and Hans if we don't feel confident about it. And then nothing that's going to go out of the building it's going to be, when the music goes out of the building to the clients, we all feel confident that this is something that is good.
Yes. Great. Now you alluded to the spotting sessions, and just for my listeners that don't know what that means, that's it's when you sit down with your creative team and you determine where music goes and also where it doesn't go. But within that, depending on the project, it can get quite detailed. Like if you were doing an animated film, you might be saying, every 7 or 8 seconds there's a element that we've got to capture, somehow. Or what I found when I write is sometimes I write down things that just let me know what's happening, but I might not mold the music around it. What kind of details go into your spotting sessions for this? Like you can use a specific cue, for example. Like, is there certain? Are you trying to tightly connect the music to the action, or is it a little bit more loose for each cue?
Well, the spotting sessions for Prehistoric were mostly the directors and producers saying, "So, guys, I want you to spot the hadrosaur in this scene." No, I'm kidding. It's a stupid joke. Kara's probably rolling her eyes.
I don't even get it.
That's great.
Well, it's like bird spotting.
Yes.
Dinosaurs. Sorry.
Oh.
Comedy is not my strong suit.
I know.
So to answer your question, some scenes are tailored the music is tailored very specifically to the action.
Yes.
Like an action sequence, for example. There are many sync points, and the tempo is very important, and it's not Mickey Mousing per se, but you really want to follow the action. That's what's making that scene even more exciting, is the music accenting certain hits, but at the same time not giving away who is gonna win the fight, for example. Other cues, other sequences that are more emotional and kind of have a longer story arc, these are more nuanced, and we would stay out of the way a little bit more.
What was so important, especially, I mean, spawning sessions are always important. For Prehistoric, Prehistoric Planet is somewhere in between a nature documentary and an animation per se. So the first cuts that we were getting, a lot of times it was storyboards, 2 frames a second. Or sometimes there were no dinosaurs because they only had the live footage of the landscape they were actually filming. All the landscapes are actually places on Earth that they filmed. So sometimes the producers would have to say, "Oh, here a herd of hadrosaurs are going to be walking, and it's going to be a time lapse." But all we see is, a lake and some trees or whatever.
Right.
Sometimes that you would have people with cutouts of like triceratopses walking around, and they said, "Oh, they're going to be animated." So what was important for us is to get as much information out of the production team of what the story arcs are and what they want to convey with particular scenes. So we could then start writing on very, very rough cuts, because the story arc wouldn't change even though we couldn't see dinosaurs on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
Great. What was the schedule like for this score? I've kind of heard from other people that with this type of project, usually it's done in all at once. So it's not like, network television where you're composing for a new episode each week. Is that the case? And if so, how much time did you have to score this entire series?
Well, we've been working on it's been released as season 1 and 2, right? I mean, season 2 is coming out at the end of this month, but we worked on it as a whole block.
Yeah.
All 10 episodes. So yes, that is true. I forget how long it actually was that we had.
We've
a little over
started,
a year.
Well, if we go from when Hans and Andrew did the theme, that was probably 2021 territory, or maybe even 2020.
Yeah, it was 2020.
We wrote the first scenes of Ice Worlds in December of 2021. And then we finished the last scene of season 2 around December 2022.
Wow.
Now we're in 2020. But mind you, I have to add this. Kara's very humble. Kara also does the music for The Simpsons, which is every episode. So she was doing Prehistoric, which we had 6 weeks per episode, roughly, plus an episode of The Simpsons every week, plus other stuff.
Right. Yeah. If this podcast were a little longer, we could just talk about how do you find time to sleep?
Sleep is very important.
Yes.
Very, very important.
Yes. All right. Well, let's talk about the sound world of this score. So, there's traditional orchestration in there. I believe I understand that you recorded in Wales, and I'll come back to the scoring session in a moment. But one of the highlights of this score is that you have a lot of specialty instruments for it that if I understand correctly, these were custom built. Is that correct?
Yes, we so me and Kara took a trip in to Arizona in December of 2021.
Mm-hmm.
It was COVID, so we just took our car and we went. And we visited, a lot of dinosaur related sites in Arizona. You have the Petrified Forest National Park, you have the Meteor Crater, the Monioke, I think I'm butchering the name, a dinosaur footprint park.
Right.
And we were trying to think how to convey the majesty and beauty of the dinosaurs in one sense, and in another sense the mystery and the otherworldliness of them. It was a completely different landscape and world that we're used to right now. And these dinosaur related sites inspired us. We thought to ourselves, why don't we try to make instruments out of the materials of which we can now study dinosaurs? So we started building instruments out of fossils, petrified wood, bones, and we developed a few instruments. This was the first one. It's called the Raptor Violin.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have the Hadro Cello, which is a cello with a bone stuck on it. We have 2 versions of the Raptor Violin made out of actual fossils, not dinosaur fossils, but Ice Age horse fossils, which is the closest we could get. We have this guy here, the Fat Rex, who became the main instrument for the Velociraptors. It has a very nice T-Rex crest on it and strings on the back that we plucked with plesiosaur and mosasaur tooths that we bought online, which are, mind you, very abundant. That I found out that they're very easily accessible. So these instruments really made such a difference in our score, because a lot of the times we would compose the orchestra around these instruments. For example, the Velociraptor scene, the whole beginning is basically improvised. The Velociraptor motive came out completely naturally, because on that day we just got the instrument back from with the first prototype of the instrument back from Charles Lebrec, who built all these instruments for us. And that would have never happened if we, tried to compose just with what we had in our computers, or, these happy accidents happen, and then you have to go, oh, this is cool, I'm just gonna keep this.
Right.
Sorry, I hope I was not too long.
Oh, no, that was fun.
Actually.
Kara, tell us about some of the other instruments and the soloists.
Very important to the score was the Yabahar.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a patented instrument created by Gorkum Sen, a musician in Turkey. I don't know if you know much about it, but you should definitely look it up or put an insert in here if you want, because it's a really cool instrument. And that was also iconic for our otherworldly sounding score. We often doubled the violin section with the Yabahar to just give it that extra otherworldly feeling. It also plays really cool effects and percussive stuff, and that's layered throughout the score. We also had Pedro, how do you say his last name?
Pedro Eustache.
Pedro Eustache,
Mm-hmm.
who is a very talented flute player, but he plays many different world flutes, and he has a bunch of unique instruments in his arsenal, and he really brought a lot of life to the score. Do you want to add anyone?
The only maybe person, if we're talking about season 1, I don't know if we can talk about season 2.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Probably stick with season 1 for now.
Yeah. So one really cool instrument that we recorded was the sub-contrabass flute. It was played by Stefan Keller, a Swiss flute player. And the sub-contrabass flute became the main instrument of the Mosasaur character. People really like that scene in Coasts where this, the biggest sea reptile that has ever lived gets cleaned by tiny fishes like manatees get cleaned by whales nowadays. Yeah, that's it. I think those are the main instruments.
Okay, now you had those. Did you all perform them yourselves? At least a lot of them. So you had to learn them. You had to practice them. Talk about just learning these instruments and being able to perform them for your soundtrack.
Well, Anže is a cellist, so it's quite.
I wouldn't call myself a cellist or any instrumentalist, really.
You know how to play the cello. It's a similar setup to a cello, and that's why it's easier for you to pick it up. But I can't play any of the custom instruments, really. The bone violin, the Raptor violin, is kind of playable for someone who can't play a string instrument, but it just sounds way better when Anže plays it because you get the vibrato. And
I mean, it was the cool thing about custom instruments is that as soon as you start playing it, the first person that starts playing it becomes the best person in the world of that instrument. I guess I am the best Raptor violin player in the world now. But joking aside, there's no correct way of playing them.
Right.
So you're kind of figuring it out along the way. We were playing with where to place the contact microphone. Do we need a contact microphone? Or how does it sound if we pluck it with a plesiosaur tooth or a mosasaur tooth or run it through an amp? It's all a big experiment, really. And if nothing else, it makes our job so much funner, at least for me.
Right.
It's a lot of trial and error. I now much rather record stuff, and even if it's not that great, then toss MIDI notes around for ages in my DAW, which is Cubase.
Nice. Now, I'm always interested in composing processes because I know there's a lot of varieties that composers use. Do you write down sketches, or do you just press record and kind of more or less improvise and then transcribe it? Or how do you, especially with deadlines, I know you can't like write every note down exactly the way you want it. You have to go through like a mock-up process. But just maybe Carol, what is your process for when you're first writing scores before it's ready to be orchestrated?
Yeah. Well, first I watched the scene like a bunch of times Anže doesn't watch it for some reason.
Yeah, it would be. Our process here is very different. I think it's interesting to share both, but we like start very, very differently.
Right.
Yeah. So I like to observe the scene, and because I like to plan what I'm gonna do. I feel like I need to know where I need to end up, because otherwise I might start too big or something.
Right.
So I only listen to the temp very briefly because I don't want it to get stuck in my head. And I usually just play the piano for a while and try to find some sort of motif or melody to latch onto. And once I have something there that I like, I then start seeing what instrumentation how I'm gonna orchestrate this.
Right. And then I assume that you guys do MIDI mock-ups of everything before. I mean, obviously, you kind of have to get the approval before you go to a scoring session. So I'm assuming that you've got, of course, the instruments you're going to use, like the Raptor Violin, but then you probably use, I guess, MIDI samples for what would what would be eventually recorded as strings and so forth. So
yeah, we have full orchestral sample libraries and very intricate mock-up techniques. The demos really sound 85% there, I mean, the demos could go on air, but it's that extra 10% that orchestra brings and breathes life into the music. I mean, you really can't compare it
right
to the mock-up. It's just,
but yeah, mock-ups are so important. And one thing that I'd really like to stress, a lot of film scoring schools teach the film scoring process in an old school way, where you have the sketch, and then after the sketch you maybe do a mock-up, and then you do a mix, and then you do a or then as I'm talking about a sole composer's job, that there's like these steps to it, which sometimes is true. But we rather think of it as it's one thing. It's all a synergy. So our writing, orchestrating, mocking it up, mixing the demo, it's all one thing. We don't write something and then go back and mix it before we send it to Hans, per se.
Yeah, the mix aspect is already happening, we don't write stuff and then, okay, let me level it out now. Like, it's already, by the time it's done, it's already mixed. But there is a step before it goes to the orchestras, that we have orchestrators that fine line music services. You should use them for all of your orchestration needs. They are great at making really neat, organized, great scores that the musicians will be very happy with. And they're adding stuff at that point too, cueing different parts just in case there's a player just sitting there. That's a whole other part of the process.
Yeah, so like with the orchestration, I can safely say that both mine and Kara's orchestrations are very strong. Yes. So if we had the time, we would be able to prepare the stuff for the orchestra ourselves. The role of the orchestrators, in a sense, is to what we have in MIDI, transcribe it down into sheet music for the live orchestra to play. And if they add stuff in, for example, we only did clarinets in the woodwind section, but we have a whole woodwind section. They would, as Kara said, cue other instruments to play lines as well. And that would always be marked in the score as cue, meaning sometimes we would say play all cues, meaning that the whole orchestration would be played, or play no cues, which would mean that it would basically be exactly the same as we wrote it in the DAW.
Nice. I just want to elaborate, just because, this is not a film music specific podcast. You may have some people listening that, this is their first episode of listening, to, working composers talking about film scoring. But when this episode comes out, I will have done a May the 4th Star Wars Day episode discussing the score for The Empire Strikes Back, and we talked about a few things. We talked about temp track, which was prevalent in the very first Star Wars film, but we didn't. One of the things we didn't really elaborate on is that John Williams obviously can orchestrate, because he started off as an orchestrator. It's like he used to orchestrate for Henry Mancini, but even he, for the Star Wars movies, had orchestrators. So it's like, if you go looking in credits, it's not a sign that the composer can't do it, but it's just the deadlines are so tight. It's not like, you're Brahms and you've got 14 years to write a symphony. You've got, to create a high volume of music in just a short amount of time. So I just wanted to add that in. Let's go to the scoring sessions now. So you, was it in Wales, I believe is what you said? Just talk about how many days and, what size orchestra did you get to use and so forth, and just anything memorable about the sessions.
It's the BBC National Orchestra of Wales.
Mm-hmm.
It's about an 80-piece orchestra, and they're all really good.
Right. Who conducted the sessions?
It was Ben Foster, I believe. But we were in Slovenia at that time on our Christmas break. And then I think the session was due to start January 7th or 8th in Wales, and we were supposed to travel there, but then COVID got really bad in the UK, so we decided just to listen in on the session from our studio in Slovenia, which was actually very nice.
Nice.
It was a very, very nice time. And as Kara said, the orchestra is, I can hands down say, one of the two best orchestras I had the privilege working with. Such great musicianship. They were very pleasant to work with. They took notes well. It seemed like they had fun during the session, which is always a good sign.
Right.
It was one of the most beautiful memories of 2022 for sure.
Great. Well, I guess my last question about the score is, how much influence did you have in creating the soundtrack album?
I mean, it's with these soundtracks, it's always like, if I can say, in a sense, killing your own babies.
Yeah.
Because we wrote roughly 3 hours of music, so we had to kill 1 hour away for the soundtrack. So it was a process of making various versions of the set list of the soundtrack, and then we don't need this because we already have this, and then we were very happy with the selection, and then the soundtrack came out and Twitter was all like, why didn't you include this, and why didn't you include the beginning of Dreadnoughtus? And people were trying to find the missing tracks that they loved, and it's always so strange to me that we have an opinion of our own, what we think, quote unquote, the best music from the show is. But then you have the audience thinking completely differently, like some obscure piece of music. So,
Kara, you mentioned that you are composer of The Simpsons, and how long have you had that gig?
Well, when I started at Bleeding Fingers, I was kind of assisting here and there on that project. That was like probably the first thing that I had to stem out. But eventually, as I was promoted, I kind of became the principal composer, and that was like 3 years ago.
Wow.
So yeah, I've been working on it since season 30. And wow. We're now going into season 35. So yeah.
Well, it's very impressive. Congratulations. And for either of you, are there any other composing projects or any projects you'd like to share that you can talk about that's going on?
Maybe not that's currently going on, but we have, obviously, season 2 is coming out May 22nd for Prehistoric Planet. It's been announced also that a show that I worked on here at Bleeding Fingers for Baz Luhrmann is coming out probably in the fall, it looks like. So that's his show, Faraway Downs. We're excited for that to get released. Anything upcoming for you, Anže?
No, I don't work as hard as you.
Well, Prehistoric Planet, sincerely, it's a great score. You guys did great work, and it was great to talk to you about the process. And you just encourage all the listeners. Again, season 1's out, season 2 is coming out. It's on Apple TV Plus, and also, go listen to the score by itself. And which I know I found it on Spotify. I'm sure it's on streaming platforms, but I'm sure everyone would love it if you'd go ahead and just buy the album too. Just go ahead and buy it and download it. And support these great composers. So Anže and Kara, thank you so much for taking time to chat with me today.
Thank
you so much, David. And if any of the audience goes to listen to the score, we want to know about it on Twitter. Even if you hate it, we want to know about it.
I'm sorry, I almost forgot to ask. That reminds me, where can people follow you online?
We're on the Instagrams and Twitter.
I also made a TikTok channel. I have 100 followers, so every follower counts. Be the first. Sign up now.
Okay. Well, excellent. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
And that just about wraps up this episode, but I wanted to make sure that you know that do check the show notes. There are a lot of links there, and some of them are for Instagram videos, which feature Anže demonstrating some of the instruments that we talked about. So definitely be sure to check that out. If you've made it this far, I have a request. If you are at least 10 years or more removed from having graduated high school, so we'll just say if you are late 20s, very late 20s or older, and you are a professional musician, a music teacher of any kind, I have a question for you. What is one thing that you have learned since you graduated high school? It could be about music. It could be something in general. One important lesson that you would share with your 18-year-old self if you could go back in time. I'm very interested in hearing your answer. You can send me a message if you prefer that way, but if you don't mind, I would love to hear your voice and to use it in an upcoming episode. You can leave me a voice message at speakpipe.com/musician toolkit. That link is also in the show notes. As a reminder, if you have a private studio of any kind, you owe it to yourself to give Fonz a try to help you with your administration and your scheduling needs. You can try that for free using the link also in my show notes. If you're watching this on YouTube, please give it a thumbs up, hit subscribe and the notifications. And if you are following this podcast anywhere, thank you. It would mean so much if you got value out of this, if you would share it with at least one other person. That's going to do it for episode 22. I will be back with you next week with episode number 23. Once again, thank you so much for listening.